migration assistant, because of its structure, is really suitable both for planning and for execution when you're doing some manual work in the execution side. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is as we go through the demo. But essentially what the migration assistant does is it programmatically decodes and inventories all of the reports and packages that are in your content store, stores all of that information in a structured database. And that database includes key details, including the data sources that are in use, the lineage, the relationships, and also pulls in the audit data regarding usage. So it gives you a really broad perspective on where and how your content is being used, and also what the structure of that content is. So how does it help? Well, number one, it gives you comprehensive, accurate data to do your migration planning and execution. It's much less error prone than the manual approach because it pulls everything in, makes sure you don't miss anything, and gives you a bunch of ways to slice and dice that information to make the decisions that make sense for your organization. It also helps you identify quick wins. So lowest hanging fruit is always a good thing to go for when you're doing a migration. So the migration assistant helps you figure out which things will be both the easiest to migrate and have the most impact. It helps you. So going back to some of the things I discussed earlier about just the general migration considerations, the migration assistant does help you find unused and duplicate reports. Those are all candidates to be eliminated. Don't need to migrate those. Helps you identify similar reports so you can decide which things make sense to consolidate. So you might be able to go from 10 reports down to 1 in the new environment. It also helps you identify the unreferenced portions of your reports and packages, and that can help you with streamlining and simplification as you go through the migration process. So let's do a demo of the migration assistant. I'm going to switch my screen here. And the migration assistant actually ships with 2 Power BI workbooks. I have these published out to the Power BI service for today's demo, but you can also use these locally in Power BI desktop. So the 2 workbooks, the first one is what we call the assessment workbook. And this is really useful during the initial stages of planning your migration. And what the assessment workbook does is it provides you with a broad overview of how things are being used, how complex they are, to help you make decisions about what should and shouldn't be migrated, and help you decide how to prioritize them. I'm going to jump around a bit here in the interface. I'm going to start, well, let's talk about the overview here on the homepage. So homepage here gives you just a summary. And incidentally, this data is from one of our local content stores, primarily has Great Outdoors content in it, of course, because those are the standard samples. Can't show you actual customer data. So this content store is a lot smaller than your content store obviously would be. That gives you a nice idea of what is provided in the migration assistant. We can see we got a little under 400 reports here in our sample content store, 19 different models, 31 users, and we're running 28 schedules. We also break out the objects by type in your content store. So we can see we've got 400 reports, 28 schedules. We've got some explorations, some data modules, some uploaded files there. You can see report executions. You get a sense of what the most popular reports are in your environment. We also measure the complexity of your reports and categorize them. So we can see not too many complicated reports here in our environment. You would likely find a fair amount of low complexity reports, but then a broader range of medium and some high complexity reports in your own environment. And jump over to the model complexity here. So this section evaluates the details about your published Cognos packages. I'm going to go ahead and sort by the model complexity score because that's the most interesting thing to me on this page. So here we can see, and this is essentially the relative complexity of your models to each other. So by doing this, we can see the most complicated package in this environment is the Go Data Warehouse analysis package. If I scroll down to the bottom, our simplest one is this Cog Report SP, which is a very simple package. That's probably just a single query pulling data. It's probably a stored procedure since somebody has an SP in there. So this page gives you an idea of how complicated your models are. And it also gives you a bunch of detail about what's in them. We can see this model has 381 query subjects, uses 71 different tables. We can see it only uses a single data source, but a lot of tables from that data source. So there's a lot of rich information available to you in here, and you can also see the path to where that package is located. Over here, we've got a 4-quadrant chart for the models. This is really useful for figuring out the lowest hanging fruit. So I'm going to start up here in the top right, low complexity and high usage. So any environment where you have simple models that are heavily used, those are great first candidates for migration. They're going to be quick to migrate. Lots of people use them. The business sees benefits very quickly. And so often you'll want to start with things that show up in this quadrant. Excuse me. Then you may want to go from there to the high complexity, high usage. We don't have any of those in this content store. These are going to be harder to migrate because they're complicated. But because they're high usage, again, they're likely to be high value to the business. Down here, you've got low complexity and low usage. These also easy to migrate because they're low complexity, but probably not as much of a priority because they're not as heavily used. And high complexity and low usage, you might want to ignore these if you can, simply because they're going to be a lot of work to migrate, and because they're not heavily used. And these often would be the last ones that you would consider if you're doing an actual migration. All right, I'm going to jump to some of the report information here. So we've got a report complexity page. This is similar to the model complexity. It gauges the complexity of your individual reports. Let's make sure this is really sorted properly. There we go. So again, this is relative complexity of all of the reports in the content store. So it gives you a sense this all data containers is our most complicated report. You can see where it's located. And there's a little bit of other information about how many times it's been executed, whether it's used by any report views, just a lot of useful info about your reports. I'm going to jump to the user summary view here. So this gives you a view of all the users in the system, how many reports they've run, when they last ran things. And so this is really useful for seeing kind of who your most active users are. And I've already got this sorted correctly. So we can see Todd Schumann here. If you've been to many of our webinars, you probably know who Todd Schumann is. He runs our Cognos installation and upgrade practice, and he uses our environments a lot. So no surprise that Todd is here at the top of our report executions. You can also see users that are in the environment but haven't actually executed any reports. So this just gives you a sense of user activity. You can also get a view of the schedules that are running. Now, often schedules in a Cognos environment can be tied to business processes. They can be tied to key daily reports, monthly reports. Often these are things that go to executives or sales teams. So often schedules are really, really important in a Cognos environment. And this gives you a sense of what schedules you have out there, how often they're running. It can help you make decisions also about which things you might want to migrate sooner rather than later in your environment. We also have a page here called V11 Object Summary. And this is an overview of objects with, V11 isn't new anymore, but there were object types that were introduced beginning in version 11 of Cognos, things like data modules, explorations, Jupyter notebooks. So we capture that information here, and you can see in this environment, we've got 180 or 155 data modules. I don't have any data sets here, no Jupyter notebooks or uploaded files, but it gives you a way to view some of those newer object types. We also summarize custom SQL in your reports. Now, everybody knows you should never, ever use custom SQL in a Cognos report. Bad design. And everybody knows that custom SQL is used heavily in Cognos reports. So this gives you a view of all the reports in your environment that do have SQL in them. It shows you the length, so we can see like this report up here has a pretty long string of SQL in it. This one just has probably a simple select. But this gives you a way to kind of get a sense of what's out there that is using custom SQL. These also, in fairness, are likely to be easier to migrate because they're probably relying much less on any of your actual Cognos packages and more on the SQL that's in there. So that would actually be easier to replicate in Power BI. Last but not least, we've got a comparison summary here. This does a full cross comparison of all of the reports in your content store and gives you a sense of which things are similar, which things are not, and helps you kind of figure out and prioritize the best way to tackle your migration. So that's the migration assessment workbook. I'm going to go over quickly to the assistant workbook, which is more of the implementation oriented workbook. So migration assistant workbook. So this workbook provides much more fine-grained detail about individual reports, packages, and is really most useful when you're actually executing your migration. So often that assessment workbook will be used by a manager or a project lead for the migration. But the assistant workbook, again, it gives you some of the same information that you saw in the previous workbook, but at a much finer grain of detail. So we can see here all of the reports in our content store. We can sort by last run. I'm just going to leave it here on the run count. So we can see this crosstab with prompt page has been the most frequently executed report in this environment. As you click on these and view a specific report, you'll see that the data updates dynamically. This also shows us, so there's a crosstab with prompt page that actually appears in two different places here. So I'm going to go ahead and choose this one. And when you select a report, you can see these are the data sources that are used by that report. These are the underlying tables that are in use. So all of this gives you key information for being able to recreate your report in the target environment. On the reports page here, this provides you really detailed information about a specific report. So in Cognos, you would have to open this up in what I still like to call Report Studio, even though it's no longer called Report Studio. You can open up your report in the reporting interface within Cognos Analytics, and you can see this information by clicking around, or you can export the XML and look at it in an XML editor if you're into that kind of thing. But you can also use our migration assistant. If you do that, you get all the information you need right here. You don't have to go digging for it. You can see all the queries that are part of this particular report. You can see the containers on the page, the types of charts that are in use, details about the query items, what expressions are used to pull the data, what filters are there, so you know what's coming in, see the underlying data sources, just a wealth of information about your report. Over here on the executions page, again, you get a more detailed view of what's been executed, how frequently, and when. It also shows you which users have executed a particular report. So this can also be, if you're looking for reports that, for example, what reports do some of our key executives like to run? You can get that information here, which can really drive some of your decision-making about which reports to migrate first. And last but not least, we've got relationships. This really gives you details about your underlying packages. And so if you've got, as a lot of organizations do, if you've got one like big hairy package that gets used for a bunch of stuff, basically a kitchen sink package, this is a great way to be able to navigate some of that without having to go into Framework Manager or without even really having to understand Framework Manager. You can just get a sense of what the data model looks like, which can help your Power BI experts do the modeling work on their side. We do offer a migration assessment service with an automation evaluation. This is a great way to get a jump start on your migration project. What that migration assessment includes is a cataloging of your entire content store using the migration assistant. We populate those workbooks that Arturo showed off to you. So you can do ad hoc analysis and planning based on your actual content. Then we take all of that, we create an assessment findings and recommendations report that's customized to your environment. It says, hey, here's what we see as the best path for you to pursue with your migration. We take you on a guided walkthrough of all of those results. And at the end of the day, you keep that assessment report, you keep migration assistant workbooks, you keep the GitHub repository, and you're able to use those throughout your migration process. And if you're interested in that assessment, you can again click on one of the links that our events team has posted in chat. Get some time with us. We can talk a little bit more about the details of how that works, what the timeframes are, what the costs are, all that.